Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Luke Fresh, a staff scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Luke is an expert in geothermal energy, oil and gas, carbon sequestration, and underground hydrogen storage, with over 10 plus years experience in theory development, modeling, lab experiments, and field study. His research focuses on rock fracturing and fluid flow coupled process. Luke holds degrees from Colorado School of Mines and the University of Canterbury, and he's also a private pilot. Luke is the lead and the sole developer of geothermal design tool, GeoDT, which he developed as a hobby to answer geothermal engineering design questions in this highly uncertain 3D fracture-dominated flow system. Please welcome Luke.
All right, thank you for the kind words. Before we get started, maybe we can get like a reaction from people here in the audience to just confirm that people have had an opportunity to install ParaView and have some working version of Python, ideally Spider, something like that, available to them. I was hoping that an email went out to inform people about that ahead of time. I see a couple people who didn't provide a reaction. In the chat, you can also try to help each other out if anybody is having trouble with that. But it'd be great if people have those tools available so they can follow along and actually do some of this themselves as we proceed through this talk today. So today we'll be going over the GeoDT tool as a methodology for evaluating the geothermal production performance of the fracture systems that you will be identifying or have identified from the microseismic data and fluid injection data and the other sources as part of this Datathon. With this tool, you'll be able to flow fluids through those fractures and evaluate the heat production from that system as a function of the well rate, as a function of the well spacing and the flow rate that you have going through that system. So without further ado, I'll quickly introduce GeoDT and what it is. So GeoDT, let me start the video here, which explains it reasonably clearly. Starts off by seeding natural fractures randomly in space, but you can also do deterministic fractures, which will be part of the bootcamp here. And then here you can see wells being placed. And then if we look at only the fractures that are connected to those wells, you can see that here. Now you're seeing the hydraulic fracture stimulation process, as well as shear stimulation, which occurs simultaneously. And then here you're seeing GeoDT seeing underneath the hood a little bit. So these pipes that you're seeing are how GeoDT solves the flow through the system. And you can see the flow rates colored by, magnitude here on those pipes. And then at the end of the video here, you can see how the color change of the nodes is modeling the temperature reduction over time as fluids are flowing through this particular design of an EGS system. On the top right, you can see an output in terms of a time series that is showing the enthalpy from each of the production wells, which in this case there are 3, over time. On the bottom right, you can see the electrical power production based on those fluid enthalpies over that same duration of time. And you can see it broken down by the power cycle that's being used. In cyan, you can see the pumping losses. So that's the energy that's being required to move fluid through the system. So that would be detrimental to the power production of that system. In blue, you can see the binary power production. So this would be an organic Rankine cycle, in this case using isobutane as the working fluid. In red, you can see the power produced by a single flash Rankine. And then when you combine these two together, along with the pumping losses, you can predict an estimate of the net produced power from this EGS system. So as you can see, using GeoDT, you can get some useful information on what the performance of an EGS site would be when you consider the geometry, the fractures in the subsurface, and the other parameters concerning geothermal power production. On the bottom right, you can see a link here to GeoDT on GitHub. So I'd encourage those of you in the audience to go ahead and grab yourselves a copy of GeoDT from GitHub. So hopefully by the end of today, by the end of the hour, you'll actually have had a chance to run it yourselves on your own local machine. So moving forward, let's talk a little bit about how GeoDT works. So you saw in the video some explanation visually of the processes that are being modeled here. But in general, starting with our problem, we want to evaluate the performance of an EGS system with some number of wells, some design parameters being considered in the subsurface with the consideration of uncertainty in that subsurface environment. So there will be natural fractures that will not be identified from microseismic data or well logs or geophysical surveys. So there are going to be natural fractures down there that are not known until they're encountered during fluid injection or with one of the wells during drilling. And then we want to, despite that high uncertainty, optimize that design in some regard so that we can get an idea of what its performance might be, or the envelope of the uncertainty of that performance. So we do that evaluation through this workflow here. We start with the system parameterization that would embed the uncertain parameters into that. And then you have the fracture generation and placement of the wells. And then there's a geomechanics solver that will actually figure out reasonable values for the hydraulic conductivity, the strength of these natural fractures and hydraulic fractures in the subsurface, and do some other coupled physics to estimate what that flow system the performance of that flow system might be. And then there's the actual flow solver, which uses a Newton-Raphson iteration, which is simple but fast and effective with the way that this system is meshed. After it solves the flow, it'll check the solution and see if it requires stimulation. If it does, it will go through and increase the pressure and what it needs to do to propagate fractures until any of several criterion are met regarding the design of the stimulation or the flow rate being required for the site. After it has a valid flow solution and a complete fracture network, it will then solve the heat transfer solution to get the cooling of the produced fluid over time, like you see in the plot on the right. On top of that, there's a basic economics module that will estimate the net present value of that system when you factor in design decision making with the when you factor in design decision making with the uncertainty and those other properties of the system. And then finally, it'll record as a simple single line output in a comma delimited file that will be structured in a way that should be quite convenient for machine learning purposes. So each row will be one realization, and then the columns will be both the inputs for the model and the outputs for the model all together. So if there are questions here, feel free to post them in the chat. And I'm seeing that there's issues with the audio.
Only one person raised these questions. So I can hear you clearly, so no problem.
Okay. All right. I see other people saying the audio is fine. All right. Sorry for the technical issues there. Okay. So getting started, let's take a look here, and this is a kind of an exercise for everybody who's in the audience right now. You can go ahead and go to GitHub, github.com, GeoDT, and you should arrive on this page here, and you'll see the branch labeled lfrash. You can go ahead and copy all of this somewhere on your computer that you want to operate the code from. If you have Python 3, that's the requirement for this code. I think it's actually using Python 3.8. So you can go ahead and install a copy. Once you have your copy installed, you'll see the same file structure here as what you see in GitHub. And the first step in order to get this code running is to grab the example file named Datathon 2023.py from the examples folder here, and to drop it on the same level as GeoDT. So you can see here as an example on my computer. If you can see the window here, it might be a little, there's white on white, so that makes it a little hard to see. But you can see if I go to Python and I go to my GeoDT folder where I have it, you can see an example drop down here of Datathon 2023 dropped in that directory. Then you will need one other piece. Once you choose your working directory, you'll have to go to the examples folder here, and you should see this MSDFN file, global coordinates. This is actually the 3D fracture geometry that was estimated by Alita Fanilla for the Forge project. And you can get this off of GDR. But this is kind of an example of somebody else's estimation of where the natural or where the stimulated fractures are in the Forge site for stimulation stages 1, 2, and 3. And this file here contains the key information. Let me open it up real quick. This contains the key information from the geometry, from her estimation of the geometry, which you can see includes, let me get the zoom factor right here. And then you got the trend, you got the fracture location of the center of the fracture, radius, orientation information. And this is a comma delimited file that I'm just viewing through Excel right now. But as long as you have a file with the same column headers and the same structure, you don't have to have them in the same order, but as long as it has the same information, you'll be able to load it with the same script that you'll be using today. So now let's go on to the next step. And if there's questions, I don't see any in chat. If anybody needs me to go back, just let me know. So the next step is to set up the actual run so that we can actually execute GeoDT and start generating some results. So in order to do this, you can see this window here on the right when I'm using Spider Python 3.8. I normally execute Spider through an external system terminal because it results in the fewest compatibility issues for when you're actually executing the code. As the file, I see a question from Kevion. Is this a simplified version fracture file? This is the comma delimited file that comes from Alita based upon the interpretation of the acoustic, the microseismic events. And then Alita also has on GDR DFN models that have a large number of predicted fractures. Those were actually done before the first stimulation events, and those use statistical information based on well logs for randomly placing fractures. That one is not as relevant to this Datathon. The one with thousands and thousands of fractures is not really the relevant one to be looking at here, in case that was unclear to anybody. So the simplified one is the more relevant one. And then, so back to this model script setup. So I normally like to execute in the external system terminal. And then the next step is to pick a working directory. So the working directory is where you're going to place the fracture geometry file, the MS DFN and global coordinates file, one that you see highlighted again here in the left, just to help everybody follow along. So you want this file in the working directory that you select. The default working directory, if you don't pick anything, is going to be wherever you have GeoDT placed on your hard drive or in the cloud if you're operating that way. But if you're going to choose somewhere else, make sure you drop a copy of this file in there, or else the code will not run. Okay, so while everybody's doing that, next we need to quickly go over some definitions for clarity purposes. So geothermal design tool, GeoDT, it requires information for the natural fractures of the type of strike and dip, these two parameters in bold down here and underlined. Those are the inputs that GeoDT expects. So the script that I provided will convert from the trend and the plunge data that's in Alita's file to the strike and dip data that GeoDT requires. To explain a little bit further, so fractures are often modeled as planes in 3D space, and the orientation of that plane is defined by the strike and dip. And here you can see kind of the gray colored side of the circle is what would be below the horizon, and the bright colored side of the circle, the white part, would be above the horizon. The horizon being the XY horizontal plane. So the strike is essentially where that surface intersects the horizon. And then the dip in GeoDT's definition is going to be looking down from the top. It'll be clockwise to the right, 90 degrees will be the steepest vector going down in the plane of that fracture. That steep down vector, the angle between that and the horizon is the dip. So in this case, you can see how the strike is actually more than 180 degrees because it's measured from north, and the dip is down to the right. So you can see that how that geometry works here if you wanted to use that same definition in your submissions. So next, we also need to talk a little bit about how well geometry can be defined, especially within the context of GeoDT. So on the basic level, you have the orientation information, which would be the azimuth and the dip, similar to strike and dip, except in this case, the azimuth would be parallel to the orientation, parallel to the vector of the well. And then you have intervals. So this is the number of isolated injection zones within the injection well. So you can set this number to essentially anything that you want to, but this will assume that each zone is completely isolated from each other. So there is going to be no communication for pressure or flow through the well between these zones. In essence, they'll be treated as a bunch of separate little injection wells by GeoDT. Then for well count, here you can see an example of 4. This is the number of production wells in the model. And in the case of this Datathon, we should be assuming a well count of 1 as our base case. In other words, 1 production well. And if you want to model more wells, that'll be up to you. Next, we'll have the radii of the wells. So the internal diameter, the casing diameter, and the diameter of the wellbore that's drilled itself. Those dimensions are already embedded into the script using forged data. So you can leave those alone in this case, unless you want to tweak them for some reason. And then there's the proportionality of the well. So this is how much of the injection well's length you would be using for an injection itself. So there's potential value in using a shorter length of the injection well than going all the way to the end or past where the production wells terminate, because you might have fractures at an angle that if you are too close to the exact same length, that fracture would have a higher likelihood of missing your production well and never connecting to it. So using a slightly smaller proportion can be beneficial. Then there's phase. This is the orientation of the production well relative to the injection well. By default in the code that in the example code, this will be -90 because the production well is going to be assumed to be drilled above the injection well. for this example, but other angles might actually be better based upon what you'd find for the most likely locations of the stimulated fractures. Then there's some more advanced parameters you can play with that we're not going to touch on right now, as well as things like the depth, where in the forge site, that's a relatively fixed parameter. So I wouldn't recommend tweaking that unless you want to get deeper into the code.
Look, we have a question on the split flow between the different injection zones in the chat.
Yeah, so GeoDT, when you're using the perforation, or sorry, the interval variable, anything other than 1, it will actually split the injection well into basically a dashed line. And each one of those intervals will be treated as its own injection well by the solver. So there is no connection between each injection well unless the flow happens to connect through the natural fracture and hydraulic fracture network. Then they will see each other. But each segment of the well will have its own flow rate and pressure boundary condition being imposed on it. And in the inputs, that the flow rate boundary condition is going to be specified with a capital Q, I, and J. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. If you're doing sand propped fractures, though, it does change a little bit. So sand propped fractures are actually a relatively recent addition to the code that was only implemented about a month ago. And in this case, instead of using the keyword intervals for defining the geometry of the injection well, you can use the perforation variable. In this case, it will treat the injection well as a single connected well with a single set of boundary conditions on the end of that well. And then it will add in these perforation zones that will be used for seeding hydraulic fractures. And it will potentially stimulate all of them together. It depends upon which fracture happens to be the weakest and most permeable as far as how the solution progresses. But the way that you control how many stimulation zones there are in that well is with this perforation count. You can combine these two together. So you could do intervals 5 and perforations 5, in which case each one of these intervals would have 5 perforations within it, giving a total in this case of 25 hydraulic fractures that would be being stimulated if you wanted to do it that way. Another key variable to consider that is different between what was the GeoDT default and what we can do now is if you're going to be using sand proppant and not just hydraulic fracturing with water, you can add in sand as one of the variables, which would be, in this case, I'm using 4.4% sand by volume, which is basically taken from a fairly typical hydraulic fracture design from, say, an industrial service provider. So numbers up and down from this are possible, but this would be kind of a nominal value that would be fairly common practice in the field. And then you can also see here a term for the proppant pack conductivity, which is in micrometers squared centimeters is the units for that one. There's a unit conversion within GeoDT to make that a little, so you can actually see how it goes into the solver. But the proppant pack conductivity will govern the initial permeability with the 0 stress state of that proppant pack. Because I'll remind you that there is geomechanical coupling. So as the stress state changes on the fracture, the permeability and conductivity of those fractures will change. And then here is just a quick graphic kind of showing a simplifying assumption that you may be interested to at least know about as you're thinking about the solutions here. In reality, hydraulic fractures are not going to be one single plane. They're going to be split into several different flakes. They might be staggered and offset. And then each one of those flakes of the fracture will be subject to some level of proppant settling, where this proppant will kind of accumulate in the bottom of those fractures. At least that's one of the common viewpoints out there. But GeoDT will simplify that down, and it will treat the fracture as a propped fracture as well as an open fracture that flow parallel to each other, kind of like a parallel circuit. And it will account for these higher level complexities by reducing the total aperture of that fracture in a way that's mathematically consistent with the more complex model for achieving the ultimate conductivity that is of interest for the final solution. And we refer to this reduced fracture geometry as the effective hydraulic aperture after all things are combined. So now I'd like to jump into a demo here because it's nice to actually see the code run. So let me bring up Spider.
Also, to continue that question, Jeff also asked the assumptions for the pressure drop across the curves.
Oh, so currently GeoDT does not have perforation factor embedded into it. You can get something similar. That's a feature that I plan to add fairly soon by modifying the choke. And this would be something maybe a little bit too much detail for this particular presentation. But just generally speaking, the GeoDT solver will model the well as a flowing pipe, and then it will model what's called a choke as the connection between that pipe and the fracture. And then it will have another flow element that models the flow through the fracture itself. So it does have the ability to account for the complexity of high pressure losses in the near wellbore zone, but the perforation diameter, those kinds of variables are not yet implemented in the code. So if we look here at the script here, we'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment about the structure of this, but you'll notice that the input file is basically embedded into the script here. You can see all the definitions of the various model parameters here. And then down here, you can see the actual execution part of the code that would actually run the model itself, as well as some additional parameterization. So the reason why GeoDT uses scripted inputs rather than loading an input file, as is more common in finite element modeling, for example, is because GeoDT will also generate the input file. So the rationality here is that there's a lot of different distributions for different variables that a user might want to consider, from uniform distributions like you see here to something more complicated, which I think almost everything in here is actually uniform. But if you have standard normal distributions or Fisher distributions that you want to use for some of these parameters, you can set it up that way if that's what your interest is. And then GeoDT, when you look at this big loop here, this for I in range 0 to 1, it will come up with a randomized set of inputs to generate the model in essence, account for the uncertainty of the subsurface. Because we don't really know where all the fractures are going to be. We don't know the properties of what these fractures will be, and sometimes it's not possible to ever know. So trying to do something that's too deterministic has a tendency to result in oversimplifying assumptions, treating things too simply, and ultimately being far more confident in the performance of the system that we really have justification to be. So GeoDT its design is intended to help with that disconnect by assuming the natural randomness from the default and then requiring their user to remove randomness from that system as they gain more and more knowledge about the site. But in terms of batch runs for statistical analysis, changing this to get lots of simulations is as simple as adding some more zeros onto this value in the IN range. And that will generate a whole bunch of different realizations, different fracture properties and different reservoir properties, all within the bounds of what we have measured for the subsurface, or what the Forge team has measured for the subsurface at this site. So hopefully I said that in a way that was clear and comprehensible. But let's go ahead and run it without further ado. So first off, when I kick this off, you'll see GeoDT creating the fractures, and that one had a flow solver issue right in the beginning. But you can see here the solution marching forward as it's stimulating the rock. And this has a flow simulation going through all the geometry, all that. Once the stimulation is done, it does a final flow solution, which represents the circulation phase of the project. And then here you can see the heat flow module marching forward in time as it's going through and figuring out the temperatures of each and every node within the flow system. And pretty soon you'll see this will complete, but we don't necessarily need to sit and watch that whole thing. Yeah, well, it's done already. So, and now it's going into the second iteration. So let's take a look at the results from that particular simulation run, and I'll delete the ones that I was looking at before this talk. So GeoDT just generated, let me bring it up here, scratch, Datathon 23. GeoDT just generated these files that you can see here. So if I drop in the fracs and the boundaries to start, and you'll see this, we'll get more and more files in here as I continue to talk, because it's still running. If we look here, let's start with the boundary of the model. So in this is ParaView that I'm using, by the way, so I'm just dropping the VTK files in here. So right here, you're seeing the size of the model domain, and it's being defined by a set of fractures. And then within that bound, you can see the natural fracture network that was being generated by GeoDT, as well as the deterministic fractures, where if you look in a little bit closer here. So these smaller, much more concentrated fractures you see in yellow, those are the fractures that are taken from Alita Fanilla's fracture geometry file, interpreted from the microseismic data. And then we can look at these natural fractures as a function of PC, which is the critical pressure, the fluid pressure required to stimulate those fractures. If I click a few other buttons, you can see how there are natural fractures in this network that are really close to a critical slip just by random chance. And then you can see in the geometry from Alita that there's some fractures here that are also close to critical slip, and then some fractures that would require higher pressures to stimulate. Now we can add in the wells. So these are the wells that were just modeled in that particular model run, and we can organize it by well type. So here you can see that there's 3 injection intervals for the injection well. And you can see the production well here in blue that's drilled. It's actually above, if I show the right orientation, you can see how that production well is above the injection well. And you can see how it's vertically above here, if I can get the angle just right. And then when you zoom in here on the fracture network, you might want to look at the fractures that are just contributing to the flow network. And we might also want to look at the nodes and the flow itself. You can see me dropping those in here. So these are the wells. These are the fractures that contribute to flow. And then these are the nodes. And then this is the flow solution. So here you can see that there happens to be a natural fracture that wasn't known ahead of time, potentially, or maybe it was, but not identified, who knows. But there's a natural fracture that was randomly seeded that happened to pass right through the flow zone, as well as some other natural fractures that are connected here. And if we look at these based upon the critical pressure required for stimulation, PC, we can see that one of these fractures is actually fairly easy to trigger, and the other ones are a little harder to activate. And then we can look at this variable called stim. The stim variable keeps track of how many times the fractures were stimulated during the stimulation process, because the stimulation is incremental, not like a progressive time marching finite, finely discretized process. It's fairly coarse how the stimulation is treated. So it's just tracking the number of times those fractures were stimulated in the course of this simulation. And you can see that the largest number of times was 5, or actually 3, if I get my scaling correct. You can see that seems to apply to a hydraulic fracture here, a hydraulic fracture here, and then one of the fractures in Alita's, or a couple of fractures in Alita's network. Okay, so if we then look at just the flow, and you can see how the flow lines coincide with the geometry of the fractures. If you look at just the flow rate, we can see how the fluid was moving through the system in this simulation. And you can see that, remove the wells too, because they actually kind of get in the way for this view. You can see that there's a lot of flow going right here from the final stage, and then a little bit less going through these earlier stages. And then there's the flow coming out of the production well. And it looks like this flow solution is on the high side. So this is a short circuiting scenario. And then, yeah, so you can kind of see how to visualize the results in 3D from a single realization. But GeoDT is designed to run, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of scenarios. So obviously looking at this in this level of detail for every single one is, too much. So the other output that's coming out of GeoDT is going to be this inputs outputs file. So if you open it in a text format, you'll see it like this. And then as a CSV, I can just rename that real quick. Or name it as a CSV. I can more easily open it with Excel to show you the structure a little more clearly. All right. So let me zoom in a little bit here too. So in this, these are the results that were just generated in right now as we've been talking here. So you can see a unique pin identifier number that helps you match this result to the visuals if you wanted to look at them in 3D. And then you can see the various properties that were used for the inputs for that particular model iteration being used here. And as we go through here, there's a split where you go from what the model inputs were to where the outputs are. It's not highlighted or anything because it's not a formatted file, but right here is where the results start. So all of these are inputs to the left, and then all of these are results from the prediction to the right. And I'll show you that back in the PowerPoint because it's a little bit clearer that way in a moment. So, now you get to see an example of GeoDT running and generating some results to play with. So, we're covering a lot of material really fast, but this presentation is recorded. So for those who need to go back and look at something a little bit more at their own speed, that recording should help with that. But now we're going to jump into a little bit of the details of how to change the settings in GeoDT to suit the needs of your modeling goals. So first off, you'll see this keyword, of hashtag exclamation points. This is just a way of flagging locations in Spider that you might want to come and look at, areas of interest in the code. Next, we have this rec from CSV function. This is a NumPy function that will be importing the fracture geometry data from your file. And then we already talked earlier about the range, for IN range parameter. So that's going to control your, global uncertainty for Monte Carlo style analysis. So you can make this number quite large if you want to for overnight runs, that kind of thing. And then you have rock.fnum. This is where you're defining the natural fractures in the site. So if you wanted to change it from the default parameters, which are embedded based upon well log data, to something else, having more fractures, having less fractures, this is where you can change that. The structure of that's a little bit strange, so I'll touch on that in just a moment. Next, you have the number of intervals. So you've already seen me or heard me mention this term several times now. That's the number of injection zones. And then we have the perforation count. So that's the number of perforations per injection zone. Then you have the sand. Another parameter that is in here is P final underscore max. That parameter is actually going to control what the maximum permissible injection pressure is for long-term injection. So generally, standard practice would require that these long-term injection pressures are lower than the minimum principal stress. But this is a modeling space that we're talking about. So if you want to remove that restriction, you can. And then after that, we have some of the functions that actually run the code. So here we have gen joint sets. So that's where we're seeding the natural fractures. If you wanted to remove that component of the code, you have the power to do so. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you want to look at any meaningful statistics because of the high uncertainty that natural fractures introduce. And then build VTK. This is the locations in the code where the actual geometry files are being constructed, the ones that I was just showing using ParaView a moment ago. And then finally, we have this well spacing. So this is a variable that I'm using to randomize how far apart the injection and production well are, to look at that as one of the variables for design. Flows is a list of the different flow rates that are being modeled. So the range that's in there kind of represents everything from extremely small to extremely large. And so the optimum should be somewhere between those values, but exactly where it will lie will depend upon the particulars of that realization for where the optimum flow rate would be for peak power production. And then dyn stim, dyn underscore stim. This is the part of the code that actually stimulates the fractures. And then finally, we have the save function. So this is generating the CSV file that we talked about a minute ago. So you already saw the execution, but I'll flash it up here for those who wanted to understand it a little bit more as to what the readout is telling them. And then the visualization, which is recommended to use ParaView, although other software will work as long as it is compatible with VTK files. And then a reminder on the summary file as to where the split is between the inputs to the model and the outputs from the model. And then for those of you who require a deeper dive to understand the other variables in GeoDT, in the documentation folder, you'll find this inputs, outputs example and description. So here you'll see a brief description of each variable in the code, as well as a version of the inputs and outputs range that was used at least at one point with this a version of the example code that I provided. So they won't exactly be the same numbers, but you can still get a good reference from this. And finally, some good quality control checks to consider on your final data set are making sure that your total injection rate makes sense. So here, the total injection rate should normally be less than capital Q INJ times W intervals. If this is not true, there is probably an error with the flow solver. Another thing to check is if the injection pressure is less than the minimum principal stress so that you're not hydraulically fracturing. If this was a boundary condition that you meant to impose, it's good to double check that it actually ended up using that properly. And then if you're not limiting that pressure, you still want to make sure that this injection pressure isn't something ridiculous, gigapascals or something like that. And then you can also check for some scenarios that do happen sometimes with runaway fractures. So there are scenarios where connectivity from a fracture to a production well is not very good. So the flow rate to that production well never reaches the stop criteria for the fracture growth, in which case the fracture will just continuously grow and hit the boundaries, and you get these really massive fracture systems that would be steadily created over time. This is something that happens arguably because of a solver error, but it also has possibility to occur in nature. So I'm still working on figuring out how to find the boundary line between those two scenarios, whether it was an error with the code or whether it's actually predicting something real, because it could be either in many cases. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to jump into questions for those who have them. And I'll start with, put this slide back up. I think this is a good place to leave it. I might start with a question for all of you to see if I can see the participants list. Maybe we can get a reaction from people to indicate whether or not they were successful in getting the code to run.
Any further questions from audiences?
Just a quick question. Where can I find the files? I wasn't able to get started, I was just listening out. I've been able to install Spider and Anaconda. So where will I get the files to use today?
Sure. I'll just show you that real quick. So if we go to GitHub.
Okay, GitHub.
All right. So we go to GitHub's main page. We can search GeoDT. And you'll see the top hit is the right one. And then here you can go to, you should end up on the LFrash branch because that's the most current one. You can just download it all as a zip file and place it wherever you like to have it on your computer.
Okay.
Or you can do a pull request if you have Git installed. As simple as that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, I did go through a lot of material really fast, so hopefully I didn't leave anybody too far behind. But when you have the recorded video, hopefully that will help if anybody wants to actually give this a shot for the Datathon. And as kind of a reminder for the the deliverables and the goals of the Datathon, GeoDT and its application apply to the kind of the third phase of the work, where once you have the fracture geometry figured out and you have an idea of where you want to put your production well, you can then use GeoDT to try to evaluate the thermal performance of that system and maybe gain some insights as to some sort of optimization that might be able to be done from stimulation perspective or from a well placement perspective. So I see a question on what does microseismic data have to do with all this? So this is easiest to see in the problem definition for the Datathon. There you'll see an example of a microseismic cloud being interpreted to estimate where the stimulated fractures were for the 3 stages that were completed for 16A, the current injection well at the Forge site. And that interpreted fracture geometry here was taken in from Alita Vanilla. And that's what this file was, this global coordinates file. And so ultimately the geometry of the fractures in this file came from an interpretation of the microseismic data. And that's where these structured fractures come from here. You can see not the teal ones, but the, here, let me just remove the teal ones. See, these fractures here come from the interpreted microseismic data, except for the new ones that were generated as part of GeoDT's execution. So how do you do variable rate injection in GeoDT is another question. So variable rate injection, this applies more to the stimulation design, the details of the stimulation design. GeoDT does have the ability to do stimulation, but it does it in a simplified way. So variable rate injection is not one of the parameters that's currently embedded in this example script. It is possible that you could look at that in a way using GeoDT by modifying how the code is executed, but that requires a lot more higher level programming and going into a lot more details than might make sense for this particular exercise. But in the end, I would say, in a way, if you want to look at those details, you can pursue other options for stimulation design that are more focused on the stimulation process itself. Because remember, GeoDT is going from the full 3D fracture network with stimulation, and it'll also go through the flow solver for long-term flow, and the heat production, and the power cycle analysis, and the net present value. A lot of times codes that are used for modeling fracture stimulation, hydraulic fracture propagation, are going to be fairly limited to that time frame, that time scale. So those same models are often not used for long-term production predictions, although there are exceptions to that. Does that make sense? Okay, so the following question is, how does this relate to the circulation strategy? So, as you might understand, the flow rate that's used for circulating through a fracture network for enhanced geothermal production is going to be a key variable to get right. And it's a very difficult variable to get right on top of that. So if you flow too slowly, you will underproduce from the reservoir because the heat production rate that you're getting is going to be relatively small. The fluid might be very hot coming out, but there's not that much of it. So the total power being produced won't be that good. If you increase that flow rate, you'll get to a point where there'll be an optimum amount of power being produced, like getting the most amount of power you can over the lifetime of that project. And then as you increase the flow rate even further, you'll end up at a point of diminishing return where the flow that's coming out is now too cold to use for electrical power production. So you're no longer getting any benefit from flowing so hard. On top of that, you're going to have higher pumping losses, also hurting you. So there's definitely an optimization on the flow rate that will be best suited for power production. And that optimum flow rate depends very heavily on a lot of things. And that's exactly what GeoDT is meant to be looking at, to help out with that type of question, is figuring out the best flow rate to use. And then other part of that question is, how does GeoDT compare to DFN works? That's a good question. Actually, conveniently in this case, I'm familiar with DFN works since I work with the people who developed that code here at Los Alamos. So DFN works is actually a discrete fracture network generation code that's coupled with other codes to solve for flow through that network, as well as chemistry reactions, that kind of thing within that network. So strictly speaking, DFN works is just a discrete fracture network generation module. But that solution right now is still under development in some ways for doing heat production modeling. And it currently does not have a component for fracture stimulation embedded. So that would have to be done separately. DFN networks is a massively parallel code that can model, potentially 1 million fractures or so, each meshed in a fine scale themselves. So it has a lot of power for the questions that it's good at. In this case, GeoDT it's kind of like the opposite. It's designed to simplify a lot of the solution, the numerical solution down, but still retain the ability to answer questions that we care about from an engineering perspective, rather than the details within the XYZ coordinates within the space. Hopefully I'm saying that in an effective way. But another way to phrase this is you can use GeoDT as kind of like your first cut to figure out what parameters you might want to use if you then want to proceed with more high fidelity modeling using tools like GFNworks. So is GeoDT integrated with ParaView as the display output? So the files being generated by GeoDT are VTK files, which you can see here in this file browser window. So the files themselves, you can actually open them. They're just text files. This just contains geometry information and information for how the coloring should be based on, the VTK format. So these VTK files are a fairly common 3D file type that can be read by a lot of different visualization tools. Right now, we're using ParaView just because it's easy to get a hold of, it's free, and it's open source. So it just creates a good starting point for those who might not have access to better visualization tools or just whatever their preferred visualization tools are.
All right, it's very close to the end of the time we could have. Look, thank you for showcasing GeoDT to us. It's a useful simulation tool that provides a clear visualization for our Datathon. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to all the audiences for participating in this bootcamp. If you have any further questions, concerns, reach out at our Slack channel. We have a Slack channel for you to communicate any concerns you may have. That concludes this bootcamp. Have a great day.